Jesus was murdered on a Friday. And our story takes place just 2 days later on Sunday. And it begins with two unknown disciples. One of them we'll come to learn is named Cleopas, whoever that is. We've never heard from him before. We'll never hear from him again. But these disciples in the story tell us that they had hoped that Jesus would be the one to restore Israel, to make Israel great again. But alas, it's not to be so. And without a leader, well, the movement dies too. And so these two disciples waste no time heading back home to their old lives. You see, if Jesus died on a Friday, they aren't allowed to travel on Saturday because it's the Sabbath. So Sunday is the first day that they can travel, and they take advantage of it quickly, taking the road to Emmaus out of Jerusalem, running from their pain as quickly as they can, putting as much distance between them and their grief as is possible. But before they left, they did hear a wild story from two of their women. They shared how Jesus had actually rose from the dead, but these disciples didn't find that credible. Courts didn't see women as credible witnesses either in that day. And it's disappointing to acknowledge that the same sexism made its way into Jesus' disciples back then also. And as these two disciples walk their boulevard of broken dreams, that Emmaus road out of Jerusalem, and away from their grief, well, Jesus joins them there on the road. These two unknowns. Shouldn't it be Peter or James, even Mary, that Jesus joins and has this conversation with? But no, it's these unknowns. And they don't even recognize him. Although grief and pain and disappointment does have a way of blinding us to things that are right in front of us sometimes, doesn't it? What are you talking about? Jesus asks them on that road as they journey. And they respond, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know?" And they don't say it, but they have to be thinking, of course not. Hardly anyone probably knows. Very few knew, besides that little small group of disciples from Galilee. Josephus is a Jewish historian who lived and was a contemporary with the gospel writers, and he says that during Passover time, which is when Jesus was crucified, that Jerusalem swelled to almost 2 million people as Jews from all over the world pilgrimaged back to the Jerusalem temple to celebrate their freedom and liberation from Egyptian slavery. Now, 2 million is probably too high. He was known to exaggerate. But even the most modest estimates say about 250,000. Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know? Of course not. The rest of the city didn't know and didn't care about the man who entered Jerusalem through that little eastern gate on a silly donkey. Some movement, they thought. They thought the world was going to change. And no one even knows what happened. And then these disciples tell their story to Jesus. And only after listening to their story does Jesus begin to speak. "Don't you believe the prophets and the scriptures?" he asked. "Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And then the story says that he interpreted to them the things about himself in all of the scriptures. I guess the real miracle is that he was able to do so in just 7 miles. And the disciples' misunderstanding is a very common one, and it has a name: triumphalism. Generally defined, triumphalism is the idea that a group of people is superior to others because of their beliefs, their religion, their skin color, or anything else, and that God wills them to triumph. This is Nazi Germany, one of the most Christian nations in the world at the time, believing that God was on their side in global conquest. It is the ideology of manifest destiny in America that justified the genocide and subjugation of entire indigenous people groups. And it is the father of white supremacy. Triumphalism is also the belief system that led even Jesus' disciples to expect that Israel's Messiah, a word that literally means the anointed one or the king, it led them to believe that Jesus ought to be doing kingly things, triumphant things, like raising an army, expelling the Romans, and conquering or converting the pagans, and then returning to Jerusalem through the grand western gate on a war horse as victorious king, a Messiah. See, these 2 disciples didn't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead because the moment that they saw him naked and humiliated on that cross, losing control of his own body's facilities, well, that was the moment they stopped believing him kingly, stopped believing that he could even be a Messiah type. So when the women share their story of resurrection, with that image already in the disciples' minds, well, those women's story fell on hard, rocky soil and never had a chance. But Jesus says that because they believed these things, these 2 disciples, because they didn't really understand what Scripture says about Israel's true king, the Messiah. Isaiah 53 is probably one of the scriptures that Jesus teaches during this time on the Emmaus road. It begins, "There was nothing attractive about him, no majesty to cause us to take a second look. One look at him and people turned away," which is exactly what these 2 disciples did when they saw his weakness. Isaiah continues, "He was beaten, he was tortured, but he didn't say a word. Like a lamb taken to be slaughtered, he took it all in silence. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away." Who could have imagined this future, he ends. Who could have imagined indeed? Certainly not these 2 disciples steeped in triumphalism, who interpreted scriptures to suit their expectations instead of letting Scripture shape their expectations. Triumphalism said that Jesus should sit on a throne, not hang on a cross. but triumphalism is not the way of Christ. The way of Christ is service and sacrifice, and it inevitably leads to suffering and death. Some physical, but for all who follow Jesus' way of life, leads to death. We die to ourselves, and we die many spiritual deaths along the way. And only then, only after death is there resurrection. But it does lead to resurrection. And that is no small thing. To follow the way of Christ is not to carve a triumphalistic path forward or to sit above others looking down, but to serve and to sacrifice for others. And if you think the heresy of triumphalism isn't alive today, then look at all those who protested the shutdowns this week. I saw plenty of signs that literally said some variation of God is protecting me from this virus. The idea that God is on my side, destining me and my tribe to triumph over others or even a virus, is a false doctrine that has caused much pain and even death over the years. It infects our political discourse, pollutes our churches, and ruins lives with its false promises and merciless policies. It leads Christian politicians to believe that sacrificing the elderly and the vulnerable for the sake of a triumphing economy is a worthy sacrifice. And if these politicians and protesters get their way too early, then triumphalism, this bad theology, is destined to cause even more pain and death. It is not even remotely Christian or Christ-like. The way of Christ is the way of the cross, and His followers embrace it. It doesn't sound like good news, but it is, because there's a secret. It's a secret that everyone knows, but too few people accept. And the secret is this: life is hard. No matter who you are or where you are from, life is already hard. Life will be hard. It is already full of a great deal of suffering and pain and grief. And theologies that pretend otherwise or offer false promises that we can escape the pain of life if we belong to the right religion and political party, or pray the right prayers and read the right books. They're lies. They don't make life any easier. They just make us more disconnected from reality and more likely to harm others. To be a follower of Jesus is to accept reality as it is, not as I would have it to be, and cope with it by living the way that Jesus lived, because that's where we'll find true love and beauty. It is a spiritual axiom that we can only experience beauty and love and goodness to the same degree that we allow ourselves to experience pain and grief and suffering. The way of Jesus teaches us how to embrace both the good and the bad so that we don't numb ourselves to the beauty and the love in life while trying to hide from its pain and its difficulties. It is also a spiritual axiom that if we do not allow God to transform our pain or our hardships, then we are destined to transmit them. And there's a lot of people right now who don't know how to invite God into their angst and pain and grief, and are working very hard instead to transmit them. One sign I saw said, "Quarantine is worse than the virus. Open the state before it's too late." When the disciples in our story reach Emmaus, Jesus makes to continue walking, but the disciples making note that it is dark outside and it's a very dangerous world to travel in the dark. They beg Jesus to come inside and to join them for dinner, and He obliges them. So they go inside, and when they sit down at the table, He takes the bread and blesses it. And then, and only then, is when they recognize Him for who He is. They don't recognize His teaching on the road. They recognize His hospitality. Now, isn't that something? It's His hospitality the same hospitality that welcomed all to the table, the sick and the ill, even before He healed them. Prostitutes and the poor, the unclean, and even those pesky rich tax collectors. All of these were actions that got Him in trouble in His ministry. And it's here, it's in this hospitality, the hospitality finally breaks through into their grief to show them who He really is. You see, hospitality is the antithesis to triumphalism. Triumphalism is about me. Hospitality is about we. Triumphalism is about winning, and hospitality is about sharing. Then the text says, and immediately Jesus disappears. And these disciples, who just a few verses before were terribly concerned about the dangers of traveling at night and in the dark, well, the Bible tells us that they immediately stand up and return to Jerusalem while it is still dark to tell the other disciples that He is alive. He is alive. And despite appearances, NorthHaven, we do live in an Easter world. Proclaiming resurrection while it is still dark is a dangerous task, but never have I lived in a time where it is more appropriate than now. And I've heard this Emmaus Road story before. I've heard it many times, as I'm sure most of us have. But I noticed something this time that I've never noticed before, and don't you tell any of my preacher friends what I'm about to say. But here's the question. In this passage, Jesus preaches resurrection both by teaching the Bible and practicing hospitality. For those two disciples, which one was more effective at proclaiming resurrection? It's hospitality, isn't it? I'm thinking of Emily and Susan Miller, who delivered an Easter basket to my daughter Hadley and then sang songs to us to cheer a gloomy pastor who can't be with his people on Easter. And I'm thinking of Kim Schooler, who hid Easter eggs for Hadley in the front yard to hunt. Or Helen and Jay, who cleared their backyard so that Hadley could play on their swing set. The little girl's having a very hard time with this quarantine. And my church is there to help her. I'm thinking of my friend Tim, who turned 30 this last week. He's a pastor in North Carolina, and it was a pretty emotional day for him for a lot of reasons. And his church knew it would be a big day, a difficult day even. So they arranged a parade to go outside of his house, complete even with fire trucks. Look at the smile on that guy's face. See, triumphalism says I deserve a parade, and I deserve an Easter egg hunt. It wallows in self-pity and sours into anger when it doesn't get its way. Hospitality says, I will throw a parade. I will hide Easter eggs for another. Hospitality is putting others first by staying at home right now, even though it isn't an insignificant sacrifice to do so. That's the way of Jesus. That's the way of the cross. Sacrifice for the good of another. Jesus is alive, NorthHaven. I see His life in you, and you are proclaiming resurrection now, even while it's dark. And I am so proud of you.